guys, Anne-Marie here, and today I am sharing another cutting template that I've used to turn a 6x6 paper pad into 49 cards this time. So all right, let's get started. I had a 48-page card maker mega paper pad, and so first, of course, I have to disassemble it. And this type of paper pad, it's supposed to be, really great for card makers. It has a lot of solids that you can use for matting. Then there's cut apart cards that you can use as focal images and or sentiments. So I am starting with a lot of papers, which obviously helps make a lot of cards. Your results will vary depending on how many papers your paper pad has or what choices you make about the cut apart sheets. These papers are also double-sided, so it was really like an embarrassment of riches with this paper pad. There's a lot of options. The most cathartic part was ripping that paper pad to pieces. There's just like a certain giddiness that comes with knowing you're going to use something up to the absolute bits, and so there's no need to preserve the packaging. So first I pulled out the cut apart cards and deciding what I'm going to do. There was 2 of each pattern, 5 different kinds of patterns. So I decided I was going to use half of them. So I picked one of each of the 5, and then I flipped them over and used the other 5 as the colors or patterns on the opposite side. Because there are, some that are cute cards, but I also liked the colors and patterns that they had on the opposite side. So I did still kind of want to use both. Next, I had to trim off the 1/2 inch at the top where the hole is punched for hanging the paper pad in a store, and that was annoying, not gonna lie. I really wish that these were perforated. Then I made my first official cut from the cutting template. So I'm going to cut at 4 inches across and go straight down. So it's going to leave me with a 4x6 inch piece and a 2x6 inch piece from each page. Then I'm going to take those 4x6 inch pieces and I'm going to trim 3/4 inch off the bottom. So this will leave a 4 by 5.25 inch piece to use as card fronts. And when I put them on a card front, it is going to leave a border of the cardstock peeking out around it. So it'll kind of give that impression of it being matted. Then that also leaves me with 3/4 inch by 4 inch strips. So I'm going to set those all aside. Then I returned to my 2 inch by 6 inch pieces and I cut all those into thirds, which resulted in 3 2x2 inch squares for each page, which was a lot. So now I had stacks of 43 4 by 5.25 inch card fronts, 43 paper strips, a 3/4 inch by 4 inch, and 129 2x2 inch squares. I had been planning on dry embossing the solid color pieces so that they had some sort of visual interest or texture, because these are really flat. Like there's no distressing, there's no implied texture like a subtle wood grain or anything, or paint, like a painterly background, none of that. So I just wanted a little bit more interest to it. And so I did try to emboss it, and it was a fail, a colossal fail. The paper just immediately cracked. It showed the white core. My embossing folder also was not as large as that piece, and I really wanted a piece that precise size. I did replace that piece because I did want to see how many cards I could make from a complete paper pad like that. So then I thought, well, I'll switch to stamping with a large background stamp, but I had the same problem. It wasn't big enough. So once I saw that it wasn't big enough, I decided to use a flip side for that piece, and that I would only stamp the solid 2x2 inch squares with the background stamp. This step was just completely unnecessary. You can totally skip the step. I wish that I kind of hadn't done it or maybe had used a softer color or something. Because I feel like those solids would have just been better to enjoy, for what they were, which is some visual breathing space. However, the next step I did, you might think it was unnecessary, but I'm very happy that I did it. It was tedious. I distressed the edges of every card front and every single 2x2 inch square. Feel free to skip. Because according to my footage, this took me about an hour and a half, and I'm not even sure I recorded all of that. It was very subtle, but I just love this effect in general. So I still was pleased with the detail that it added, and it's kind of an easy way to add texture. But again, you may choose to skip this entirely, or maybe you prefer to ink the edges, or maybe you like to matte every single thing in a contrasting color. So do whatever, speaks to you there. I did skip distressing those teeny tiny strips, the 3/4 inch by 4 inch strips, because that would have been just too nightmarish. All right, but now's my favorite part, making the combinations. So here you can see the overall layout of the cards taking shape. So we put the card mat down, which is the 4 by 5.25 inch piece. And then we're going to take 2 of the 2-inch squares and put them kind of catty corner to each other, spreading them diagonally, upper left, and then a step down to the right, but still kind of occupying that kind of top center space of the card. Then we're going to take a 3rd square and center that on top of the 2 with some foam adhesive, and that's where the focal image is going to be. So what that means is for each paper in your pad that you choose to chop up with the cutting template in mind, you're going to create that many cards. So I had set aside 5 of my sheets because they were cut apart sheets. That left me with 43 pieces of paper that I cut into these pieces. And every piece of paper, I cut that card front and 3 2 by 2 inch squares. And for every card, I'm using that piece of paper and 3 2 by 2 inch squares. So I know I'm going to get 43 cards already. And then I was able to eke out 6 more with scraps, and we'll talk about that when we get there. At this point, I realized I'd almost forgotten to cut the cut apart cards apart. So I went and cut them up, and I paired them with backgrounds too. There were a few of the cut aparts that I didn't feel really lent themselves well to cards. They felt more scrapbooky to me, and I just ended up tossing those. But you can tuck those in with your scrap stash if you would like. In general, I really tried not to mix motifs, and I also tried to have a cohesive color scheme with my combos. So I paired pumpkin images or sentiments with pumpkin background patterns, for example, or the pie one, I paired it with the baking patterned paper. I stuck with like a green, yellow, brown color scheme for the sunflower patterns and an orange, green, neutral for the pumpkin patterns, that kind of thing. For most of the cut aparts, they were so large that I probably could have skipped the 2 by 2 inch squares, but I just kind of played around with that, and I liked having them because it added kind of a photo corner element, almost accent on those, and I thought that looked nice. So after I made the combos and stacked them up, I hadn't stuck anything down yet in case I wanted to play around with the combos as I went, because as you know, once you get down to the dregs, sometimes those combos they get hard. And maybe you have to rethink some of your previous combinations and swap some colors around, steal a neutral from one, that kind of thing, just to make the last few pieces work. Next, I adhered those combos down and I sorted them accordingly. One pile needed both a focal image and a sentiment. One pile only needed a focal image because I used a cut apart sentiment. And one pile only needed a focal sentiment because I'd used a cut apart image. And there was a 4th pile that was already finished. Woo! All right, so the missing element that seemed easiest to tackle first was the sentiment. So I, because I could just choose one and use it for all the cards that needed it. So I found one that said, "I'm so thankful for you," which matched the season and Thanksgiving. And this particular one happens to be a very small sentiment. So I pre-cut my 1/4 inch strips of white cardstock for my scraps. And then I used an acrylic block to stamp on each end of the strips. And I used the same color ink that I used for the background plaid stamp on the solid 2x2s. And then I just snipped them off of each end of the strip. And that has left me with other 1/4 inch pre-cut strips now that I can use for another sentiment. Then it was time to figure out the focal images. Now this one was a little trickier just because I wanted, again, to have those cohesive motifs and colors. And I was already committed to using each piece of paper as kind of the foundation of the card. And I had not set aside any to cut my focal images out of. So you know what I usually do, which is I go to my scrap stash You can make this easier on yourself. Just go to Dollar Tree and look for some fall stickers. I've seen some really pretty ones there, like some really pretty leaves, and they were the perfect size to fit in those 2 by 2 inch squares. And you got about like a dozen stickers for $1.25. So that would make it way easier on you. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. If you, however, are like me and you need to use up your stash, then here's the process that I used. I first found dies and punches that had the right kind of shape and size as what was in my paper. I found a pumpkin that would fit. I found an apple, but I don't think I used it. I found a flower punch, and I found some flower dies that I could cut multiples of. Then I went through my scraps and found colors that would coordinate decently with the muted fall colors in this paper pad. These were not perfect matches, and I was okay with that. I did, however, age the pumpkins a little bit. I used some brown ink just to kind of soften down that kind of glaring orange of the scrap that I was using. And then I also pressed the very top of the pumpkin where the stem is directly onto that vintage photo ink pad to color it brown. Just quick and easy way to color that. You could also use a marker. That just happened to be, I had the ink pad out, so I just did that quick and easy. The pumpkins still by themselves looked a little plain to me, so I did go back and I found a green scrap and I cut these kind of ivy corners that I have, and I cut those apart into smaller pieces and used them for vines and leaves around the pumpkins. For the flowers in this paper pad, I had the Spellbinders die with the rounded petals, and it cut 16 of these suckers at a time. So it was a quick and easy way to cut a lot of flowers at once. I also had a raindrop punch that I used on the rest of my green scraps, and I used those to make the leaves for the flowers. For the sunflowers, those do have pointed petals. So I did have this larger petal punch, and I, for most of them, layered 2 of these yellow punched out flowers to make a full sunflower. And then I had some large flat glitter dots in my stash. They were orange, so I just colored them really quick with an alcohol marker to make them brown. You could still see the sparkle through it, but it was obviously more muted. Then for the smaller flowers, I added brown or gold rhinestones in the center of the flowers. The very last thing I did was to glue down the sentiment strips. Even though that was like the first thing that I made, it was the last thing that I added because I just wasn't sure where I wanted it yet. Because it is very small, so it doesn't have a lot of visual weight to it. The image with all the blocks up there, and some of my images are kind of detailed. Those are definitely going to kind of draw more attention. So I ended up centering it pretty close to the focal image so people wouldn't miss it. At this point, I've got 43 cards that I love and a pile of oddball scraps, but I was determined to use as many as I could and make as many more cards as I could. So my general idea was to wallpaper these scraps directly onto a card front. I knew this wasn't going to be a perfect fit vertically, and I just was stuck in thinking of it vertically. So I chose to stagger them similar to how wood floors have their planks staggered. However, I realized later you could do horizontal cards with the strips and line up 7 across the front and leaving like a 1/8 inch margin all the way around, and they would fit perfectly and you'd get more cards. So feel free to try that and see if you can break that 50 card barrier that I just wasn't able to break this time. I just prefer vertical cards, and so I usually think of those first. And I really kind of liked the chaos of all the patterns and colors and staggers. I know I likened it to a hardwood floor, but it was kind of like a strip quilt too. Like that's kind of what it made me think of. So choose your own adventure. Then I trimmed off all the overhang, including there's a little tiny strip along the right where the scraps overhang the card. So you have to flip over the card to notice that, and I did cut those off. I pitched everything tiny, but if there were larger pieces that I thought I could use to fill in more staggered gaps, I kept those and I just kept going. I topped these with a single square and a focal image and sentiment. I did ink the sentiments on the edges so they had a little better chance of being seen since there's so many white-based patterns that were in this paper pad and my sentiment was on white. All right, so I reassessed what I had left and I decided to use that same wallpapering strategy but with the 2 by 2 inch squares. So I put them 2 across and 3 down. This left a 1/4 inch uncovered to the right, so I trimmed that off. I don't think most people are going to notice if it's not perfectly the size of a typical A2 card, and it's still going to fit in that A2 envelope. Then I placed, to make sure this was all kind of evenly placed, however, I did place the center square of the column first, and I centered it roughly to the card. Then I placed the square above and placed the square below. So that also created overhang on either side, but that resulted in a more even distribution of the squares vertically. I did also consider just doing 4x4 square cards, and that would have been completely cute. So, if you like square cards, you can try that. I did a little stagger of the smaller strips, and I layered those kind of haphazardly. I just kind of angled them this way and that. So there was a little bit of subtle movement on the card, and everything wasn't really rigid. And then I placed my cut apart sentiment strips over them for these cards. All right, one more time. Rallied the troops, gathered everything that was left, and tried to visualize enough for, one more Frankenstein card. And I thought, yeah, I got enough. So I started jigsawing all the little bits and pieces together. This might be a step too far for some of you. I get it. Just pitch them. That's fine. But for me, at this point, I was enjoying kind of that problem-solving aspect of it. So I went for it. And as I glued these down, I did have to occasionally overlap pieces to avoid gaps, but that wasn't too difficult. I just had to kind of go slow and double check as I glued things down that they were covering all the white space around it. This one ended up with several sentiments on it, so I decided I'm not going to add a sentiment. And I also opted for no focal image, as it was already pretty chaotic. And I think that will be a perfectly fine kind of casual note card. Drop it off on a friend's porch or tuck it into a potluck dish or something. Just something really casual. So that gives me my final count of 49 cards. That one last Franken card pushed me past the page count of the paper pad. So I was really pleased with these, and I'm going to select my favorites to give to our guests at Thanksgiving with a little note about the things that our family loves about them. And yeah, I was proud of these. I like how they turned out. I think they're really cute. So I hope you like this idea, and if you try it, I would love to see it. So comment below with your channel or Instagram handle, and I will come check that out. I will be back in late November with some last minute, quick and easy Christmas cards from a 6x6 paper pad. So I hope you'll tune in for that. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate your time. If you enjoyed this video, please consider subscribing. I will see you next week with something else. And in the meantime, I hope you have a scrappy, happy week. Bye.